You're listening to Ghostumentary Scary Short Stories, original pieces updated throughout the week.
Of course, Jeff and Kevin had always heard the stories. Living near Sierra Sky Ranch in Oakhurst, it was hard not to. The old golf course, tucked into the woods, was legendary among the locals, and not for the well-kept fairways or the lazy afternoons spent chasing golf balls, but for the ghost stories, specifically for him, Mr. Ely. They'd grown up hearing the name whispered by the older kids, then passed down to them, each telling adding another layer of unease. Ely had been the caretaker of the course, an old cowboy who kept the grounds looking sharp back when Sierra Sky Ranch was more than just a sleepy nine-hole. Some said he died on the property, that his ghost never left. The staff told stories of hearing boots walking the halls at night, or doors slamming shut when no one else was around. Some even swore they'd seen him, a shadowy figure in a tattered hat, silently patrolling the course as if it was still his to tend. But Jeff and Kevin never bought into any of it. At least, they didn't let on that they did. The two 14-year-olds had always been a little too cocky for their own good, but that didn't stop them from sneaking out late at night, using the rumors of Mr. Ely to mess with the golf course staff. On more than one occasion, they'd bang on the windows, or rattle the garage doors to send some poor night shift worker into a panic. Once, they even scrawled "Get Out" in red spray paint on the clubhouse wall and signed it Mr. Ely. They'd laughed about it for days. But that night was different. It started like any other. After spooking a few staff members by pounding on the windows and darting out of sight, they decided to cut through the course on their way home. It was late, and the thick trees surrounding the course cast long, twisting shadows under the pale light of a crescent moon. The air was cool, and the faint sounds of nighttime creatures rustled through the underbrush. Nothing unusual for the Sierra Nevada foothills, except for that bush. Jeff noticed it first, a dense patch of brush, swaying more violently than the others. "Raccoons," Kevin muttered, shrugging it off. But Jeff wasn't sure. It was too large, too deliberate, and as they got closer, the hairs on the back of his neck began to prickle. Something felt wrong. They kept walking, their youthful bravado refusing to let them back down. The closer they got, the more their curiosity turned into something else. Fear. It crept up their spines, cold and slow, like ice water dripping down their backs. "Think it's a bear?" Jeff whispered, his voice tight. "Nah, just a deer or something," Kevin said, though his eyes betrayed the confidence in his words. But the rustling didn't sound like any deer. It was heavier. The leaves shook with the weight of something far larger than any animal they'd seen before, and as they stood just feet away from the bush, the movement stopped. Silence, the kind that makes your ears ring. They were frozen, breath held, staring into the dark tangle of branches, waiting. Then it exploded. A massive, shadowy form burst from the bush, its wings spreading wide, impossibly wide. 6 feet, maybe more. The sheer force of it sent both boys stumbling backward. The creature didn't flap. It leaped, silent but for the rush of air from its wings. Jeff couldn't see where it went, or even what it was. Just a huge, dark shape moving with impossible speed. Without a word, both boys bolted, running as fast as their legs would carry them. Terror gripped them so tightly they could barely breathe. Neither dared look back. They ran side by side, sprinting through the course, their feet barely touching the grass. They were running so fast, it felt like they were flying too. When they finally stopped to catch their breath, they stood panting in the middle of the fairway, drenched in sweat despite the cool night air. They didn't speak at first. How could they? "Did you see?" Jeff started. "I didn't see anything." Kevin cut him off, his voice trembling. What the hell was that? Before Jeff could respond, a new sound filled the air, a rhythmic whoosh, like the beating of wings. Large wings, heavy wings. It was circling them. The sound came from all around, but they couldn't see it. The darkness was too thick, and the beast was too quiet. Occasionally, the flapping would stop altogether, leaving them in eerie silence, only for it to start again, closer than before. "We need to get out of here," Kevin said, his voice tight with panic. "Let's just run back home." "No. Wait," Jeff insisted. "If we move, it'll hear us. Just stay quiet." But Kevin had had enough. "Screw this. You can stay if you want, but I'm going." Without another word, he turned and jogged into the darkness, heading back toward his house. Jeff watched his friend disappear, swallowed by the shadows of the course. His legs screamed at him to follow, but something held him in place. He wasn't sure what, fear, maybe, or the sick feeling that something worse was about to happen. Then he heard it, the beating of wings, then a thud. A scream ripped through the night, loud and sharp, followed by silence. "Kevin," Jeff whispered, his voice barely audible. He wanted to run, to go after his friend, but his feet wouldn't move. His heart pounded in his chest, but his body was paralyzed, too terrified to respond. After what felt like an eternity, he forced himself to move. Slowly, he crouched down, making his way through the course, creeping from tree to tree, his hands brushing against the wet grass. The silence was overwhelming. No animals, no wind, nothing but the occasional distant flap of wings. Even the crickets had gone quiet. As he crawled, he could finally see his house through the trees at the edge of the course. The lights inside glowed warmly, beckoning him like a lighthouse in the storm. But they were still so far away. His clothes clung to his body, soaked through with dew. The grass beneath him was slick, the cold seeping into his bones. Jeff kept his eyes locked on the distant glow of his house. His only focus now was getting home. He was so close. Suddenly, there was a thud in front of him. Jeff froze. A low moan followed, a sound that sent chills down his spine. It was Kevin. It had to be. He crawled closer, his stomach turning with each inch. In the faint moonlight, he could see Kevin's body, twisted, broken. His left arm was mangled, the flesh torn away as if something had ripped it off. Blood soaked the grass around him, pooling beneath his friend. "Kevin," Jeff whispered, but there was no response. He crawled closer, his hands trembling. The boy in front of him wasn't moving anymore. Jeff wanted to scream, to call for help, but no sound would come. His throat had closed up, frozen in terror. He was only a few feet from his house, just close enough to see his father standing in the kitchen window. Relief flooded him. He waved his arms, trying to get his father's attention, his mouth open to scream, but all that came out was a weak croak. His father glanced up, his face concerned, then turned away from the window. Jeff's legs shook as he stood in the grass, the warm glow of his house just yards away, the faint outline of his father standing in the kitchen window. Relief surged through him, threatening to spill over into tears. He was going to make it. He was safe. His dad would see him, come running, and everything would be okay. He raised his arm, waving frantically, trying to shout. But his throat was locked in fear. Only a cracked whisper escaped his lips. His father glanced up from the sink, his face etched with confusion, then concern. For a split second, their eyes met through the window, and Jeff's heart leapt. His father saw him. Jeff watched as his father set the dish down, moving toward the door. Yes, he was coming. Jeff tried to scream again, louder this time. His voice broke free, and a hoarse cry tore from his throat. "Dad!" The kitchen door creaked open, and his father stepped out into the night. Squinting into the darkness, Jeff stumbled forward, his legs feeling like lead. He was so close. His father took a few steps toward him, a look of confusion deepening into fear as he saw his son's frantic gestures. "Dad!" Jeff shouted again, louder now, the sound cracking in his chest. His father was moving faster now, arms outstretched, rushing toward him. Jeff's heart soared. He could feel it. He was going to make it. They were just a few yards apart. A few more steps and swoosh! The air exploded around him, a powerful gust knocking him flat on his back. His ears rang as he hit the wet grass. The wind knocked from his lungs. Dazed, Jeff scrambled to his feet, searching the dark sky, but there was nothing. Nothing but the empty stretch of grass where his father had been. He was gone. The realization crashed over him like ice water. His father was gone. No trace. No sound, only the lingering whoosh of wings. Distant now, almost mocking. Jeff's breath came in ragged gasps. He turned wildly, searching the sky, the trees, the shadows, desperate to find some sign, any sign of where his father had gone. But the night was still, too still. Even the wind seemed to have died. A scream built in his chest, but it wouldn't come. He was frozen, paralyzed by the emptiness where his father had stood. His legs buckled, and he sank to his knees, the cold grass soaking through his clothes, mixing with Kevin's blood still clinging to him. He sat there in the wet darkness, staring blankly into the void where his father had disappeared. The last light from the house flickered in his peripheral vision, a cruel reminder of the safety just out of reach. But safety was gone now. There was nothing left, just the night, the silence, and the weight of knowing that he was alone. And whatever had taken them was still out there, waiting.
Looking for more scary tales? Subscribe to our podcast and visit ghostumentary.com. Let us know what you think or share with us your scary tales. We might just make a new story from it.